thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the fate of a nation's industrial soul could hinge on the future of a single car, the Jeep Compass? And what if the fallout from that single decision could force a country to question a century of allegiance to its closest ally and contemplate a new uncertain future? In the intricate dance of global economics and politics, there are moments that transcend mere business transactions, becoming instead powerful symbols of a nation's sovereignty and resolve. For Canada, such a moment arrived with a force that rattled the foundations of its political and industrial spheres. It began with a name, Stellantis, a multinational automotive behemoth once heralded as a cornerstone of Ontario's manufacturing future. The narrative was supposed to be one of revitalization and partnership, a story where billions of dollars in Canadian investment secured thousands of jobs and positioned the nation at the forefront of the electric vehicle revolution. But this narrative was abruptly and for many brutally rewritten. Stellantis, after accepting generous Canadian subsidies and making solemn promises, executed a stunning pivot, choosing to cast its lot not with the Canadian workers who had built its vehicles for decades, but with the turbulent, tariff-laden landscape of Donald Trump's America. The company's decision to renege on its commitment to build its new Jeep Compass in Brampton, Ontario, and instead funnel a staggering $13 billion into its U.S. operations was more than a corporate maneuver. It was perceived as a profound betrayal. This act, however, did not unfold in a vacuum, nor was it met with the quiet acquiescence that might have been expected in years past. The response from Canada was swift, unified, and furious. From the highest office in the land to the factory floors of Ontario, a chorus of condemnation erupted, signaling that Canada would not be a passive spectator to its own economic unraveling. Prime Minister Mark Carney, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, and federal ministers spoke with a singular, resolute voice, declaring the company's actions unacceptable and threatening severe legal and financial repercussions. This was not just about one factory or one automaker. It was a direct challenge to Canada's economic dignity, a test of its ability to withstand the immense gravitational pull of its southern neighbors' protectionist agenda. The Stellantis crisis became a crucible, forcing a national conversation about economic dependence, the efficacy of corporate subsidies, and the urgent need for a more resilient and independent path forward. As the gears of international trade ground against the pressures of populist politics, Canada found itself at a crossroads, faced with a decision that would define its economic identity for a generation: continue as an appendage to the American economic machine or forge a new, more sovereign destiny. To truly understand how we reached this point, we have to look at the genesis of the crisis, which lay in a broken promise, a covenant with Canadian workers and taxpayers that was shattered with a single corporate announcement. Stellantis' abandonment of its Canadian production plans for the new Jeep Compass was a calculated decision that sent shockwaves through the nation's industrial heartland. For years, the Brampton, Ontario assembly plant had been a stalwart of Canadian automaking, a source of stable, well-paying jobs and community pride. The future of this facility was believed to have been secured through a landmark agreement, a pact under which the Canadian and Ontario governments had committed billions of dollars in public funds. This massive financial injection, part of a broader strategy to anchor the next generation of automotive manufacturing on Canadian soil, was earmarked for the intricate and expensive process of retooling the Brampton plant and for the development of a new electric vehicle battery facility in Windsor. These were not mere grants. They were strategic investments in a shared future predicated on the company's explicit commitment to maintain and expand its Canadian footprint. The betrayal was felt most acutely by the more than 3,000 unionized workers at the Brampton plant. They had been living in a state of suspended animation since February, when Stellantis had first paused the retooling process, leaving them on layoff and their futures shrouded in uncertainty. The final announcement that the Jeep Compass, the very product meant to revitalize their plant, would instead be built in the United States was a devastating blow. It transformed their uncertainty into a grim reality, raising the specter of permanent closure and the erosion of a way of life that had supported their families for generations. The public funds, intended as a shield to protect these jobs, now seemed like a squandered treasure, a testament to a faith that had been misplaced. Compounding the sting of this withdrawal was the sheer scale and audacity of Stellantis's concurrent pivot to the south. The company did not simply trim its Canadian operations, it launched one of the most significant investment drives in its history, and it was aimed squarely at the United States. Stellantis announced a monumental $13 billion investment strategy to bolster its American manufacturing footprint over the next 4 years. This colossal sum was designated to reopen, expand, and modernize a network of plants across the American Midwest, promising the creation of 5,000 new American jobs. The specifics of the plan revealed a comprehensive strategic realignment. The Jeep Cherokee and Compass, once slated for production in Mexico and Canada respectively, would now be assembled at the Belvidere plant in Illinois, breathing new life into a facility that had faced an uncertain future. A new mid-size pickup truck, widely expected to be a Ram-branded version of the popular Jeep Gladiator, was slated for production in Toledo, Ohio, leveraging the existing expertise of the Wrangler and Gladiator assembly lines. Further investments were planned to refresh the Dodge Durango in Detroit, Michigan, and to establish a new 4-cylinder engine plant in Kokomo, Indiana. This was not a piecemeal adjustment. It was a wholesale consolidation of the company's future production within American borders, a clear and unambiguous signal of where its long-term priorities lay. The primary catalyst for this dramatic reversal was as political as it was economic: the formidable and unpredictable force of President Donald Trump's America First trade doctrine. The decision by Stellantis was a direct and strategic response to the persistent threat of tariffs and the intense political pressure exerted by the Trump administration. The core logic of this new American industrial policy was simple and potent. If you want to sell your vehicles in the vast and lucrative American market, you must build them in America. For a global automaker like Stellantis, this was not a principle to be debated, but a reality to be navigated. The risk of crippling tariffs on vehicles imported from Canada or Mexico was too great to ignore. From a purely business perspective, the move, while painful for Canada, was a pragmatic act of self-preservation. Stellantis' chief executive officer, Antonio Filosa, was making a calculated bet, doubling down on the market that had historically been the company's profit engine. Before its transatlantic merger, the company's U.S. operations had consistently accounted for a remarkable 60% of its global profits. Faced with a choice between loyalty to its Canadian commitments and securing its access to its most critical market, Stellantis chose the latter. It was a stark illustration of how national politics could override international business agreements, leaving a trusted partner like Canada out in the cold. Now, in the face of what was widely seen as a national slight, Canada's leadership did not equivocate. The response was a rare display of cross-party unity, a powerful chorus of condemnation that reverberated from Parliament Hill to the provincial legislature. At the forefront of this charge was Prime Minister Mark Carney, who framed the issue not merely as a business dispute, but as a fundamental defense of national integrity. He publicly labeled Stellantis' move a profound betrayal of Canadian workers and a flagrant disregard for the taxpayers who had invested heavily in the company's future. When challenged by a reporter suggesting that Canada's contracts were weak and ultimately unenforceable, Carney's rebuttal was swift and absolute. He dismissed the premise as categorically wrong, asserting with unwavering confidence that under his government, Canada's word and its legal agreements carried significant weight. Beyond the public pronouncements, Carney took direct action, revealing that he had personally spoken with the global chief executive officer of Stellantis. This was not a negotiation, he implied, but a firm reminder of the company's binding commitments and an expression of Canada's deep disappointment. In his actions and his words, the Prime Minister positioned himself as the chief defender of Canada's economic honor, signaling to the world that his nation would not be easily dismissed or taken for granted. Echoing this fierce resolve at the provincial level was Ontario Premier Doug Ford, whose reaction was a fiery blend of anger and populist defiance. Known for his plain-spoken style, Ford did not mince words, calling President Trump's protectionist policies absolutely crazy and an affront to the long-standing economic partnership between the two nations. He immediately moved to apply financial pressure, making it unequivocally clear that not a single penny of the provincial funding allocated for the Brampton project had been dispersed, nor would it be released until the government received ironclad assurances and a clear timeline for the plant's future operations. But Ford's vision extended beyond simply holding Stellantis accountable. He issued a passionate call to arms, urging the federal government to hit back hard against American protectionism. He argued that Canada's typical approach of quiet diplomacy was failing, and that it was time to leverage the nation's considerable economic power. With righteous indignation, he reminded his audience that Canada is the number one customer for U.S. goods, purchasing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of products annually. This, he contended, was a powerful weapon that Canada should not hesitate to wield in a burgeoning trade war. Ford's enraged response resonated with a public that felt increasingly bullied by its larger neighbor, transforming him into a champion for a more assertive and combative Canadian stance. Adding a crucial legal dimension to this multi-fronted response was Federal Minister Melanie Joly. While Carney provided the prime ministerial gravitas and Ford delivered the populist fire, Joly brought the hammer of accountability. She declared the Stellantis decision to be completely unacceptable and made a solemn vow to the affected workers and their families that the government would fight relentlessly for their jobs. Her words were backed by concrete action. Joly confirmed that the government had dispatched a formal letter to the Stellantis chief executive officer, a missive that was not a plea, but a clear and unambiguous threat of legal action. She argued that any company, regardless of its size or influence, that accepts billions of dollars in Canadian financial support enters into a sacred pact to maintain its presence in the country. To then cower to the White House, as she put it, after taking Canadian funds, was a breach of that pact that demanded real and severe consequences. This legal threat added a formidable new layer to Canada's strategy. It signaled that the country was prepared to move beyond political rhetoric and engage in a protracted legal battle to enforce its contracts and reclaim taxpayer funds. Together, the unified front presented by Carney, Ford, and Joly constituted a comprehensive and robust defense, demonstrating that Canada would deploy every political, economic, and legal tool at its disposal to protect its interests. And while the politicians debated policy and threatened lawsuits from on high, the most immediate and human cost of the Stellantis decision was, of course, borne by the workers on the ground. Their voice was channeled through Unifor, the nation's largest private sector union, and its national president, Lana Payne. With clarity and conviction, Payne framed the looming closure of the Brampton plant not as an isolated industrial dispute, but as a critical existential test for the future of Canada's entire manufacturing base. In what became a rallying cry for the labor movement, she declared Brampton to be the line in the sand. This powerful metaphor captured the profound stakes of the confrontation. Payne argued that if a multinational corporation could be allowed to shutter a key facility in response to foreign political pressure, abandoning thousands of Canadian workers after securing billions in public subsidies, it would set a catastrophic precedent. A failure to stand firm and defend the auto sector in this moment, she warned, would be an open invitation for similar attacks on Canada's forestry, steel, aluminum, and other vital industries. The fight for Brampton was, in her view, a fight for the soul of Canada's industrial economy. From this perspective, the crisis demanded more than just a reaction. It required a fundamental reassessment of Canada's national strategy. Payne articulated a powerful case for a more assertive and strategic approach to its relationship with the United States. She forcefully rejected any notion of Canadian impotence, arguing that the country possessed significant and often underutilized leverage. She methodically listed the critical resources and materials that the American economy depends on from its northern neighbor. Canadian aluminum and steel, essential components for manufacturing and defense. Canadian energy, a vital element of North American energy security. And Canadian lumber, a cornerstone of the U.S. construction industry. They can't build things without us, she asserted, a simple statement that underscored a complex codependency. Payne openly questioned the effectiveness of the government's current approach, which seemed to prioritize diplomatic conversation over direct confrontation. In the face of escalating tariffs and the blatant poaching of Canadian jobs, she suggested that the time for polite discussion had passed. It was time, she argued, to seriously rethink Canada's retaliation strategy, to strategically deploy its economic leverage not as a threat, but as a necessary defense mechanism to protect Canadian jobs and preserve its industrial sovereignty against an increasingly aggressive trade partner. Her call was for a Canada that recognized its own strength and was unafraid to use it. But even as this unified front was presented to the public, a different, more critical conversation was taking place in the background. As the crisis deepened, the unified outrage of Canada's political and labor leaders was met with a more skeptical line of inquiry. A counter-narrative began to emerge, one that questioned the very foundation of the government's industrial strategy and painted a picture of a nation grappling with a sense of economic impotence. At the heart of this critique was the controversial issue of the massive government subsidies, which some analysts began to reframe not as a strategic investment, but as a form of corporate welfare. The argument was made that the tens of billions of dollars promised to Stellantis and other automakers were a sign of underlying economic weakness. If a manufacturing project, particularly one undertaken by a titan of industry with revenues in the hundreds of billions, requires a subsidy package worth up to $52 billion, does the free market truly support its viability in that location? This critical perspective suggested that the Canadian government was not securing the future, but attempting to purchase it, using taxpayer money to artificially induce a market outcome that was not organic. From this viewpoint, Stellantis' decision to leave was not a betrayal, but an inevitable economic correction, a company ultimately following the more powerful and natural market currents leading to the United States. This critique was intrinsically linked to a broader and more uncomfortable comparison of the two nations' economic climates. The debate forced a stark question into the public discourse. If you had $13 billion to invest, would you choose the Canadian economy with its higher taxes and complex regulatory environment, or the more dynamic, larger, and business friendly market of the United States? For critics, the answer was self evident. They portrayed the impassioned responses of Canadian leaders as little more than performative grief and rage, an emotional outburst that did little to alter the fundamental economic realities. Premier Doug Ford's fiery speeches, while cathartic, were seen as having no real influence on the decisions being made in corporate boardrooms or in the White House. More pointedly, Prime Minister Mark Carney's deliberately confrontational rhetoric towards President Trump was analyzed as a potentially counterproductive strategy. While his tough talk may have played well to a domestic Canadian audience weary of American pressure, it was seen as likely to alienate and antagonize a notoriously transactional and thin skinned U.S. administration, making any form of negotiated settlement more difficult. This perspective painted a grim picture of Canada as a nation caught in a strategic bind, too small to win a direct economic conflict with the U.S., yet too proud to simply acquiesce, leaving it with a policy of loud but ultimately ineffective protest. This all brings us to the fundamental question at the heart of this entire affair. Out of the crucible of the Stellantis crisis, a more profound and far reaching question began to take shape, one that extended far beyond the fate of a single factory. The confrontation forced a national moment of introspection, a collective reckoning with Canada's long standing and deeply ingrained economic dependence on the United States. For decades, the guiding principle of Canadian economic policy had been alignment and integration with its powerful southern neighbor. This crisis, however, served as a jarring wake up call, starkly illustrating the perils of being so tightly tethered to the political whims of Washington. The sudden and unilateral nature of the American protectionist turn exposed Canada's vulnerability. The incident ignited a national conversation about the urgent need to cultivate a greater degree of economic sovereignty to build a future where the country's industrial health was not contingent on the shifting political winds in another nation's capital. The question was no longer simply how to manage the relationship with the U.S., but how to fundamentally redefine it. In the midst of this strategic uncertainty, a surprising and potentially transformative alternative path emerged from the East. While the United States was busy erecting trade walls, China was proposing to open a door. A bold and unconventional trade deal was floated. China offered to remove its punishing tariffs on Canadian canola, a move that would immediately unlock billions of dollars for beleaguered Canadian farmers who had been largely shut out of a critical market. In exchange for this significant concession, Canada would be required to do one thing: eliminate its own steep 100% tariff on Chinese made electric vehicles. This proposal was more than a simple trade off. It was a strategic gambit that offered Canada a tangible alternative to its North American economic focus. It presented a direct challenge to the status quo, forcing policymakers and the public to weigh the benefits of a new partnership against the potential risks of alienating its traditional allies. To fully grasp the gravity of this choice, one must understand that this is not a simple economic calculation. It is a profound geopolitical tightrope walk. A move towards China, even one as seemingly pragmatic as this, would be viewed in Washington not as a clever trade diversification, but as a strategic defection. In an era of escalating great power competition, economic policy is inseparable from foreign policy. Accepting China's offer could invite retaliatory measures from the United States, a trade partner that still accounts for the vast majority of Canada's exports. The U.S. could exert pressure in countless other sectors, from softwood lumber to dairy, turning a single automotive dispute into a multi fronted economic conflict. This places Canada in an almost impossible position. On one hand, the status quo has been exposed as dangerously precarious, with the nation's industrial strategy held hostage by the whims of American politics. The logic of diversifying away from such a volatile partner is undeniable. On the other hand, the act of diversification itself carries the risk of antagonizing that very partner, potentially making a bad situation catastrophically worse. It's a choice between a known vulnerability and an unknown but potentially greater peril. The debate over this single trade proposal, therefore, becomes a microcosm of Canada's larger strategic dilemma in the 21st century. This prospective deal with China crystallized the fundamental choice facing Canada. It was a choice that transcended the immediate concerns of cars and canola, touching upon the very essence of the nation's future identity on the global stage. One path was to continue the difficult and often frustrating work of maintaining its economic alignment with the United States, accepting the inherent vulnerabilities in exchange for the benefits of proximity and shared history. The other, more audacious path was to embrace the opportunity presented by the Stellantis crisis as a catalyst for change. This would involve actively forging a more independent and diversified economic strategy, one that proactively builds new trade routes and cultivates new partnerships with emerging global powers. The conflict for Canada was no longer just with a single corporation or a single U.S. administration. It was an internal conflict about its own appetite for risk and its vision for the future. The Stellantis standoff, born of a broken promise in Brampton, had evolved into a defining moment of economic reckoning. It forces every Canadian to confront a foundational question about their nation's place in the world. Is Canada destined to remain in the economic orbit of its superpower neighbor, or does it have the will to navigate the turbulent waters of a multipolar world and chart its own course? The ultimate test for Canada was not whether it could follow America's lead, but whether it possessed the courage and the conviction to finally lead itself.